My name is Betty, and I am 64 years old. For 35 years, I have carried the weight of being both mother and father to my children after my husband's sudden heart attack left me to raise Kevin and Lisa alone. After my husband's passing, every extra shift I worked at the elementary school, every penny I saved was for my children, ensuring their future and their dreams could still come true. And for decades, I was Nancy's rock as well, my sister-in-law, who seemed to stumble from one crisis to another. I bailed her out of countless financial disasters, emotional meltdowns, and poor decisions, always hoping my support would lead her to stability, believing in the unbreakable bond of family and the duty we owe each other in times of need. But when I gently finally refused Nancy one last desperate loan request, her vengeance ignited like gasoline touched by flame. She poisoned my children's minds with fabricated tales of neglect and emotional abandonment that never happened. Kevin's email arrived 3 days later, raw with manipulated anger and years of false memories Nancy had planted like seeds in fertile ground. "You were never truly there for us, Mom. I want nothing to do with you anymore." My heart didn't just break that Tuesday morning. It imploded my entire life's dedication as a mother, viciously negated by lies so cruel they took my breath away. Yet amidst the crushing despair that threatened to swallow me whole, a teacher's meticulous habits held a hidden truth that Nancy could never have anticipated. They didn't know about my daily planners documenting every precious moment with my children for over 3 decades. Nor did they know about the boxes of their heartfelt letters and handmade cards overflowing with love and gratitude that painted a very different picture of our family. My truth was hidden from their current rage, but not lost forever. And now, I would find a way to make it undeniable. The silence that followed Kevin's devastating email was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life. For 2 days, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at those cruel words on my laptop screen, reading them over and over until they burned themselves into my memory like a brand. "You were never truly there for us, Mom." How could the boy I had held through countless nightmares, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose dreams I had nurtured with every ounce of my being, believe such a fundamental lie about our life together? I called Kevin first, my hands trembling as I dialed the number I knew by heart. The phone rang 4 times before his voicemail picked up that familiar voice, now cold and distant. "Kevin, sweetheart, it's Mom. Please call me back. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. We need to talk about what Nancy has told you. None of it is true, honey. None of it." When that call went unanswered, I tried Lisa, my daughter, who had always been my closest confidant. Her phone went straight to voicemail, too, and I knew with sinking certainty that they had discussed this between themselves, that Nancy's poison had already spread through both of my children like a disease. I left message after desperate message, my voice growing more strained with each attempt. "Lisa, baby, please pick up. It's about Nancy and the things she's been saying. You know me better than this. Remember when you were 8 and had pneumonia, I slept on the floor beside your bed for a week. Remember our Sunday morning pancakes, our shopping trips, all those times I helped you with homework until midnight. Please just talk to me." The response came not from Lisa, but from Kevin, a text message so cold it might have been written by a stranger. "Stop calling us. Nancy told us the truth about how you really treated us. We need space to process everything. Don't contact us again until you're ready to take responsibility for your actions." Nancy's vindictiveness revealed itself gradually, like a slow-acting poison designed to cause maximum pain. Through Mark, her son, who had always resented what he saw as my children's advantages, I learned that Nancy had been planning this campaign for weeks. Mark posted on the community Facebook page, where half our town gathered to share news and gossip, his words carefully crafted to sound reasonable while delivering maximum damage. It's so sad when parents can't see their own failures. He wrote in a post that garnered dozens of sympathetic comments. My Aunt Betty has always put herself first, and now she's surprised that her kids are finally standing up for themselves. Some people just can't handle being told the truth about their neglect. The comments that followed were like daggers in my chest. People I had known for years, parents whose children had been in my classroom, neighbors who had smiled and waved at me for decades, all expressing their sympathy for my poor children and their disappointment in me as a mother. I always wondered why those kids seemed so withdrawn, wrote someone who barely knew us. Now it makes sense. Lisa's silence was perhaps more devastating than Kevin's angry words. Where Kevin's fury suggested hurt that might eventually heal, Lisa's complete withdrawal felt like a door slamming shut forever. She blocked my number, unfriended me on social media, and according to mutual friends, spoke about me only to say that she was processing childhood trauma and needed space from toxic family dynamics. Nancy's campaign intensified when she realized how effective her initial strikes had been. She began making veiled threats suggesting that if I didn't publicly acknowledge my failures as a mother and apologize for my selfishness, she would be forced to reveal even more painful truths about my character. Betty needs to take responsibility, she told anyone who would listen. Until she admits what she did to those poor children, this family can't heal. The most insidious part of her strategy was how she encouraged others to share their own observations about my mothering. Suddenly, normal parenting moments from years past were being reinterpreted through Nancy's malicious lens. The time I had been late picking up Kevin from baseball practice because of a school emergency became evidence of my chronic neglect. The Christmas when money was tight and gifts were modest became proof of my emotional unavailability. Mark amplified every lie, every twisted memory, every cruel interpretation of my love for my children. He created social media posts featuring old family photos, adding captions that painted innocent moments in sinister light. A picture of me looking tired at Lisa's graduation became evidence that I had always been more focused on my own problems than my children's achievements. The public humiliation was suffocating. At the grocery store where I had shopped for 30 years, conversations stopped when I entered. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. The principal at my old school, where I had been Teacher of the Year 3 times, suddenly found reasons to cancel our usual monthly coffee meetings. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Nancy's revenge was how she demanded that I grovel for forgiveness for crimes I had never committed. She wanted me to publicly admit to being a neglectful mother, to validate her lies by accepting blame for the pain she claimed my children had suffered. All Betty has to do is apologize, she would say with false sympathy, but her pride won't let her admit she was wrong. The impossible position Nancy had created was diabolical in its cleverness. If I defended myself, I was being defensive and proving her point about my selfishness. If I stayed silent, my silence was taken as admission of guilt. If I tried to show evidence of my love for my children, I was being manipulative and trying to rewrite history. As I sat alone in my empty house that first week, surrounded by 35 years of memories that Nancy had somehow poisoned with her lies, I began to understand the true depth of her malice. This wasn't just about the money I had refused to lend her. This was about decades of resentment, jealousy over the life I had built with my children, and a vindictiveness so deep it was willing to destroy innocent relationships to satisfy her need for revenge. The public attacks escalated beyond anything I could have imagined as Nancy realized just how much damage she could inflict. Mark began posting old photos he had somehow obtained from family gatherings, adding captions that twisted innocent moments into evidence of my supposed neglect. A picture of me reading a book while the children played became Betty ignoring her kids as usual. A photo from Lisa's 10th birthday party, where I looked exhausted after working a double shift to afford her gifts, was captioned, "Even on her daughter's birthday, Betty couldn't be bothered to engage." The comments on these posts were like acid on open wounds. Those poor children wrote people who had never even met us. No wonder they're struggling with trauma now. Others shared their own stories of neglectful parents projecting their pain onto our family situation and adding fuel to Nancy's fire of lies. Nancy's campaign grew more sophisticated as she contacted people from my past, twisting shared memories to create false witnesses to my alleged coldness as a mother. She called my former neighbors, my old teaching colleagues, even parents of my children's childhood friends, weaving carefully crafted stories that contained just enough truth to seem plausible, while fundamentally distorting the reality of our family life. I always worried about those children, Nancy would tell anyone who would listen. Betty was so wrapped up in her own career and her own needs that she never really saw how much they were hurting. She thought providing for them materially was enough, but children need emotional connection too. The realization hit me like a physical blow as I sat in my living room surrounded by photo albums that told the true story of our family life. Nancy wasn't just lashing out in anger over my refusal to enable her financial irresponsibility anymore. This was a calculated, deeply malicious campaign designed to destroy not just my relationships with my children, but my very identity as a mother and my reputation in our community. The cruelty of it took my breath away. For decades, I had supported Nancy through every crisis, every bad decision, every moment when she needed someone to believe in her. I had emptied my savings account more times than I could count to keep her afloat. I had listened to her sob through countless phone calls about her failures and disappointments. I had defended her to my own children when they questioned why I continued to help someone who never seemed to learn from her mistakes. The memory that broke me completely came flooding back as I held a photo of Nancy and me from 15 years ago, both of us smiling at Lisa's high school graduation. Nancy had been facing embezzlement charges from her job at a local nonprofit money she had taken to fund her gambling addiction that our family didn't even know existed. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she was looking at possible jail time that would have destroyed her son Mark's chances of getting into college. I had taken out a second mortgage on my house without telling anyone, borrowing $30,000 to hire the best criminal defense attorney in the state. I had sat through humiliating meetings where lawyers discussed Nancy's addiction and poor choices, my own reputation suffering by association. I had endured months of stress and financial strain, all to keep my sister-in-law out of prison and protect her family from the shame of her conviction. Nancy had never even thanked me properly. She had accepted my sacrifice as if it were owed to her, as if my willingness to risk my own financial security for her well-being was simply what family members were supposed to do for each other. And now, that same woman was using my own children as weapons against me, destroying the most precious relationships in my life to satisfy her vindictive need for revenge. When I finally gathered the courage to confront Nancy, directly calling her number with shaking hands, her response revealed the true depth of her pathological malice. "Betty, you brought this on yourself," she said, her voice cold and satisfied. "You always thought you were better than me with your perfect little family, and your stable job. You looked down on me every time you had to bail me out of trouble. Well, now you know how it feels to lose everything. I never looked down on you, I whispered, my voice breaking. I loved you like a sister. I sacrificed everything to help you because I thought that's what family does for each other. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Nancy replied with chilling satisfaction. You act like you're this perfect mother and sister, but you're just as selfish and controlling as everyone else. Your children are finally seeing the truth about who you really are, and I'm not going to let you manipulate them anymore. The conversation ended with Nancy making an even more outrageous claim, telling me that my children had confided in her about years of emotional neglect and manipulation that had supposedly scarred them for life. According to her newest lies, I had been psychologically abusive, using guilt and financial control to keep my children dependent on me well into adulthood. Mark amplified these lies online with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found a way to hurt the aunt he had always resented. He posted long, detailed accounts of supposed conversations with Kevin and Lisa, describing their relief at finally being free from my toxic influence, and their gratitude to Nancy for helping them see the truth about our family dynamics. The suggestions about my mental health came next, delivered with false concern that barely masked their cruelty. Maybe Betty should seek professional help, Nancy mentioned to mutual friends. She seems to be having trouble accepting reality. Sometimes people become delusional when their carefully constructed image of themselves falls apart. Mark was even more direct in his online campaign, suggesting that I was experiencing some kind of mental breakdown and that my inability to accept my children's truth was evidence of deeper psychological problems. It's sad when people can't face their own failures, he wrote. Maybe professional intervention is needed here. The isolation became complete and suffocating. Invitations to community events stopped coming. Former friends found excuses to avoid me at the grocery store. The book club I had belonged to for 8 years suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever I tried to attend. Even my church, where I had been a faithful member for over 20 years, felt different as whispers followed me down the aisle and conversations stopped when I approached. But the most devastating blow came from Lisa's continued silence. Kevin's anger, while painful at least, suggested that some part of him still cared enough to feel hurt. Lisa's complete withdrawal was like watching someone I loved die while they were still breathing. She had blocked my phone number, removed me from all social media, and according to mutual friends, spoke about me only in clinical terms, about processing trauma and setting healthy boundaries. As I sat alone in my kitchen that night, surrounded by the deafening silence of my empty house, I finally understood the full scope of what Nancy had accomplished. She had taken 35 years of love, sacrifice, and dedication and twisted them into a narrative of neglect and abuse so convincing that even my own children believed it. She had stolen not just my relationships with Kevin and Lisa, but my very identity as their mother. The social isolation became so complete and public that leaving my house felt like walking through a minefield of judgment and whispered accusations. At the post office, conversations stopped mid-sentence when I entered. At the bank where I had been a customer for 25 years, tellers who once greeted me warmly now avoided eye contact. The pharmacist, Mrs. Chen, who had filled my prescriptions for decades and always asked about my children, now served me with professional coldness that felt like ice in my chest. Former colleagues from the elementary school, where I had taught for 15 years, crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. Parents who had once thanked me tearfully for helping their struggling children through difficult academic years now looked at me with suspicion and disappointment. The principal who had written glowing recommendation letters for my children's college applications suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever I tried to arrange our usual monthly coffee meetings. The community Facebook group, where I had once shared photos of student achievements and school events, became a source of constant torment. Mark continued his campaign with the dedication of someone on a mission, posting daily updates about my supposed mental instability and my children's brave decision to distance themselves from their toxic mother. The comments grew increasingly cruel as people who barely knew our family felt emboldened to share their judgments about my failures as a parent. In a moment of utter desperation, when the silence from my children had stretched into its third week, I sat down at my computer and wrote what I knew might be my final letter to them. My hands shook as I typed, pouring out 35 years of love into words that felt inadequate to convey the depth of my devotion to them. My dearest Kevin and Lisa. I began tears blurring my vision as I tried to find the right words. I don't know what lies Nancy has told you about our life together, but I need you to remember the truth of who we were as a family. Kevin, do you remember when you were 7 and had that terrible fever that wouldn't break? I held you in my arms for 3 straight days, barely sleeping, taking your temperature every hour, and singing the lullabies that always calmed you down. I wrote about Lisa's first heartbreak at 15, how we had stayed up all night talking about love and disappointment while I held her as she cried. I reminded them of our Sunday morning tradition of making pancakes together, how we would tell stories and laugh until our sides hurt. I described the countless school events I had attended, the homework sessions that lasted past midnight, the sacrifices I had made gladly because their happiness meant everything to me. I mortgaged this house twice to ensure you both could go to college without debt. I wrote my tears falling onto the keyboard. I worked extra shifts every Christmas so you could have the gifts you dreamed of. I sat through every soccer game, every school play, every parent-teacher conference with pride bursting from my heart because you were mine, and I was so grateful to be your mother. The letter was 20 pages long by the time I finished a desperate attempt to remind them of a lifetime of love that Nancy had somehow convinced them to forget. I printed it out, hand-wrote their names on separate envelopes, and drove to the post office with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. Lisa's response came 5 days later, not as a letter or phone call, but as a brief, devastating email that felt like a blade through my chest. Betty. She wrote, not even calling me Mom anymore. Your letter is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior that Nancy warned us about. You're trying to rewrite history and make us feel guilty for protecting ourselves from your toxicity. Please don't contact us again until you're ready to take real responsibility for the damage you've done. The formal clinical tone of her response was more painful than any anger could have been. This wasn't my emotional, passionate daughter speaking. These were words that had been coached, phrases that sounded like they had come from a psychology textbook rather than from the heart of a child I had loved unconditionally for 28 years. Nancy's ultimate cruelty revealed itself at the annual community potluck dinner, an event I almost didn't attend, but forced myself to go to in a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She arrived with Mark, Kevin, and Lisa in tow, presenting them as a united family while positioning me as the outcast who had been rightfully rejected. The sight of my children laughing and talking with Nancy as if she were their beloved aunt, while treating me like a stranger they were embarrassed to acknowledge, was more devastating than anything I could have imagined. Nancy caught my eye across the room and smiled a cold, satisfied expression that told me everything I needed to know about how much she was enjoying my destruction. But it was during the dessert portion of the evening that Nancy delivered her most calculated blow. Standing near the dessert table, where several people were gathered, she spoke just loudly enough for me to hear, while pretending to console Kevin about our difficult situation. "I know this is hard for you, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But sometimes children have to make tough choices to protect themselves from parents who can't accept their own failures. Your mother's refusal to acknowledge how her neglect affected you and Lisa is just proof of how selfish she's always been." The people around them nodded sympathetically, some shooting glances in my direction that mixed pity with judgment. I stood frozen by the punch bowl, watching my sister-in-law poison my relationships with surgical precision, while my own children nodded along with her lies. That night, sitting alone in my living room while the rest of my family celebrated their newfound closeness without me, the most devastating memory of all came flooding back with crystal clarity. It was a secret I had kept for over 20 years, a moment that completely recontextualized Nancy's lifelong resentment and revealed the true depth of her vindictive nature. Lisa had been 8 years old when she came home from school, crying because some older children had been teasing her about her clothes. We didn't have much money that year. I was still paying off debts from my husband's medical bills, and Lisa's wardrobe consisted mainly of hand-me-downs and discount store finds. But her tears broke my heart, and I knew I had to find a way to help her feel confident and beautiful. I had been saving money for months to buy myself a winter coat to replace the one that was falling apart, but I took that money and bought Lisa 3 new outfits instead. I never told her about the sacrifice. I just presented the clothes as a surprise and watched her face light up with joy and confidence. Nancy had been visiting that day and witnessed the entire exchange. Later, when Lisa was upstairs trying on her new clothes, Nancy had cornered me in the kitchen with an expression I had never seen before. "You think you're such a perfect mother," she said, her voice low and venomous. "Always making the rest of us look bad with your grand gestures and your martyrdom. You make me sick." I had been stunned by her viciousness, unsure where it had come from or what I had done to deserve it. "Nancy, I just wanted Lisa to feel good about herself," I had said, confused by her anger. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," she had replied, her eyes cold with a hatred that took my breath away. "You always have to be the hero, don't you? Always have to show everyone else how much better you are than them. Well, someday your children are going to see through your act, and when they do, I'm going to be there to help them understand what you really are." At the time, I had dismissed her words as jealousy or temporary anger. I never imagined that she would hold on to that resentment for 20 years, nurturing it until it grew into the weapon she was now using to destroy my life. But now I understood that every kind gesture I had made, every sacrifice I had offered, every moment of joy I had shared with my children had been building Nancy's resentment like kindling, waiting for a spark. She hadn't just been waiting for an opportunity to hurt me. She had been studying my relationships with my children for decades, noting their vulnerabilities and my parenting choices, cataloging everything she would need to turn them against me when the moment was right. My refusal to give her money had simply provided the excuse she needed to implement a plan she had been developing for years. The realization filled me with a cold, hard clarity that cut through the devastating pain like a knife through fog. Nancy hadn't just betrayed our family bond or taken advantage of my generosity. She had systematically planned the destruction of my relationships with my children, using their love and trust as weapons against the mother who had devoted her life to their well-being. But I was not the same woman who had raised her children alone after her husband's death. I was not the same person who had sacrificed everything for Nancy's well-being without asking for gratitude or recognition. I was a mother whose children had been stolen from her through lies and manipulation, and I would not go quietly into the darkness that Nancy had tried to create around me. The teacher who had spent 15 years advocating for vulnerable children was about to become an advocate for herself. The mother who had fought through poverty and grief to give her children the best life possible was about to fight for something even more precious, the truth about who we really were as a family. Nancy thought she had won, but she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated the strength of a mother's love and the power of 35 years of documented devotion. The battle for my children's hearts was far from over, and I had weapons that Nancy didn't even know existed. The morning after the community potluck, I woke with a clarity and purpose I hadn't felt in months. The devastating pain was still there, a constant ache in my chest that I knew would never fully disappear, but alongside it was something new and powerful: determination. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I made my coffee slowly, deliberately, the same way I had every morning for the past 35 years. But this morning was different. This morning, I wasn't just surviving another day of heartbreak and isolation. I was preparing for war, and I had ammunition that Nancy could never have anticipated in her wildest dreams. My first stop was the spare bedroom closet where I had stored decades of teaching materials and personal records. Behind boxes of lesson plans and student artwork, I found what I was looking for: 35 years of daily planners, each one meticulously maintained with the obsessive attention to detail that had made me an effective teacher and devoted mother. With trembling hands but fierce determination burning in my chest, I carried the first box of planners to my dining room table and began the arduous process of reviewing my life's documentation. Page after page revealed the truth that Nancy had tried so desperately to erase. Every school event I had attended was recorded in my careful handwriting. Every doctor's appointment, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game and piano recital was documented with dates and times. March 15, 1998. Kevin's science fair project due tomorrow. Stayed up until 2 a.m. helping him with volcano display. So proud of his creativity and effort. April 3rd, 2001. Lisa's first track meet. Took half day off work to watch her run. She placed third in the 800 meters, and her smile was worth everything. December 22nd, 2005. Christmas shopping with both kids. Kevin picked out earrings for his girlfriend. Lisa found the perfect sweater for her best friend. Love watching them grow into thoughtful young adults. Entry after entry painted a picture of active, devoted involvement in my children's lives that completely contradicted Nancy's narrative of neglect and emotional abandonment. I had recorded not just the big moments, but the small ones too. The nights I had stayed up nursing them through illnesses, the weekend mornings we had spent making pancakes and telling stories, the countless hours I had invested in their homework, their dreams, their fears. Most revealing were the entries that mentioned Nancy herself, scattered throughout the years like breadcrumbs leading to the truth about her character. Nancy missed Mark's graduation again. Third family event this year she skipped. The children are starting to notice. Lent Nancy another $500 for rent. Hope this helps her get back on her feet. Nancy seemed bitter tonight at dinner. Made several cutting remarks about perfect mothers that made everyone uncomfortable. But the planners were just the beginning. My real treasure trove was hidden in the basement storage room in boxes I had lovingly labeled and organized over the decades. Hundreds of letters, cards, drawings, and handwritten notes from Kevin and Lisa, dating back to their earliest attempts at writing. The first card I opened was from Kevin, written in crayon, when he was 6 years old. Dear Mommy, thank you for taking care of me when I was sick. You are the best mommy in the whole world. Love, Kevin. Another from Lisa at age 8. Mom, you are so nice to me. Thank you for helping me with my homework every night. I love you more than chocolate ice cream. The teenage years were represented too in more sophisticated but equally heartfelt expressions of love and gratitude. Kevin's high school graduation card to me read, Mom, I know I don't say it enough, but everything I've accomplished is because of your love and support. You sacrificed so much to give me every opportunity, and I promise to make you proud. You're not just my mother, you're my hero. Lisa's college acceptance letter was accompanied by a note that brought tears to my eyes. I got into State University. I know the tuition is expensive, but you always told me education was the one thing no one could ever take away from me. Thank you for believing in my dreams and working so hard to make them possible. I love you, Mom. Each letter, each card, each handmade gift was like a thread in a tapestry that told the true story of our family. These weren't the expressions of children who had been neglected or emotionally starved. These were the words of young people who felt deeply loved, supported, and valued by their mother. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Nancy and Mark were basking in what they believed was their complete victory. Mark continued his online campaign with even more enthusiasm, posting daily updates about my mental breakdown and celebrating the strength Kevin and Lisa had shown in cutting ties with their toxic mother. Some people just can't accept when their children see them clearly. Mark wrote in a post that garnered dozens of supportive comments. My cousins are finally free to live their lives without guilt and manipulation. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from family dysfunction. Nancy, according to mutual friends, was practically glowing with satisfaction. She had been telling anyone who would listen that my attempts to contact my children proved how desperate and unhinged I had become. Betty just can't accept that her perfect mother act has finally been exposed, she reportedly said to her neighbor. Kevin and Lisa are better off without her drama and neediness. They had no idea that while they were celebrating their perceived triumph, I was building a case against them that would expose their lies with devastating clarity. They thought they had destroyed me, reduced me to a broken old woman who would fade away quietly into irrelevance and shame. They were wrong. I was a teacher who had spent 15 years advocating for students who couldn't advocate for themselves. I was a mother who had documented every precious moment with her children because I understood that memories fade, but written records endure forever. I was a woman who had survived the death of her husband, financial struggles, and every other challenge life had thrown at her. Nancy's greatest mistake was assuming that because she operated through lies and manipulation, everyone else did too. She couldn't conceive of a mother who had actually been as devoted and loving as I claimed to be. She had built her entire campaign on the assumption that I was hiding dark secrets about my parenting, that somewhere in my past were real failures she could exploit. But there were no dark secrets. There were only 35 years of documented love, sacrifice, and devotion that would soon expose her lies for what they truly were. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and devastating to her narrative. Soon, everyone would see the truth about who Nancy really was, and more importantly, who I had always been as a mother. 2 weeks after discovering my documentary treasure trove, I found myself standing outside the community center, staring at a hand-lettered sign advertising Silver Steps Dance Class, gentle movement for active seniors. I hadn't danced since my wedding day 36 years ago, but Dr. Martinez, my family physician, had suggested I find some form of gentle exercise to help with the stress-related tension that was affecting my sleep and appetite. The decision to walk through those doors was harder than it should have been. After weeks of isolation and public humiliation, the thought of being around other people filled me with anxiety. What if they had seen Mark's posts? What if they believed Nancy's lies about my character? But something deeper than fear pushed me forward. Perhaps it was the same stubborn determination that had carried me through single motherhood, or maybe it was simply the human need for connection that even the deepest pain couldn't completely extinguish. The instructor, Martha Williams, was a woman about my age, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She welcomed me with genuine warmth that felt like sunshine after months of living in shadows. "You must be Betty," she said, consulting her clipboard. "I'm so glad you decided to join us. Dancing has a way of healing things that words sometimes can't reach." The class was smaller than I had expected, maybe 10 people total, but the atmosphere was warm and accepting. As we moved through gentle stretches and simple dance steps, I felt some of the crushing tension in my shoulders begin to ease. For the first time in months, I was just Betty the person, not Betty, the accused neglectful mother, or Betty the community pariah. It was during the cool-down period that I met Dr. Evelyn Reed, a woman whose presence commanded immediate respect despite her petite stature and gentle demeanor. She introduced herself simply as Evelyn, but when Martha mentioned that she was a retired child development psychologist who had spent 40 years working with families in crisis, something in my chest loosened with hope. "Betty seems troubled about something," Martha said, with the intuitive kindness of someone who had spent decades reading the emotional states of her students. "Maybe you two should talk." After class, Evelyn invited me for coffee at the small cafe next door. Something about her calm, professional demeanor made me feel safe enough to share my story, though I started tentatively, unsure how much to reveal to someone I had just met. "My children have been turned against me." I began carefully watching her face for signs of judgment or disbelief. "My sister-in-law has convinced them that I was a neglectful mother, and now they won't speak to me at all." Evelyn's expression grew more serious as I continued her trained psychologist's mind, clearly recognizing patterns I didn't even realize I was describing. When I mentioned Nancy's systematic campaign of lies and Mark's online character assassination, she leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who had seen this particular form of cruelty before. "What you're describing sounds like parental alienation," she said gently. "It's a form of psychological abuse where one person systematically turns children against a parent through lies, manipulation, and emotional coercion. The fact that this happened so suddenly after you refused to enable your sister-in-law's financial irresponsibility suggests this was planned rather than spontaneous. The validation was like water in a desert. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was speaking to someone who understood the psychological mechanics of what had been done to my family, someone who didn't immediately assume that where there was smoke, there must be fire. "Do you have any documentation of your relationship with your children?" Evelyn asked. "Letters, photos, records of involvement in their lives." In cases like this, objective evidence can be crucial in helping victims of alienation see through the lies they've been told. When I told her about my planners and the boxes of letters from Kevin and Lisa, her eyes widened with professional excitement. "Betty, that kind of documentation is incredibly rare and powerful. Most parents don't keep such detailed records of their involvement with their children. What you have could be absolutely crucial in helping your children remember the truth about your relationship." The next week, I invited Evelyn to my house to review the evidence I had collected. Martha came too, having become invested in my story and eager to offer whatever support she could. When I spread the planners across my dining room table and opened the first box of letters, both women fell silent, clearly moved by the overwhelming evidence of my devotion to my children. Evelyn picked up one of Kevin's letters from high school, reading it with the careful attention of a professional who understood its significance. "This isn't just a thank you note," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is a young man expressing profound gratitude for a mother's love and sacrifice. Children who are neglected or emotionally abused don't write letters like this." Martha was examining my planners, tracing the entries with her finger as she read about countless school events, medical appointments, and family activities. "Betty, this is 35 years of proof that you were an incredibly involved, devoted mother. How could anyone look at this evidence and believe you were neglectful? Because they haven't seen it yet," Evelyn said, her psychologist's mind already formulating strategy. "Nancy has controlled the narrative completely up to this point. She's told a story that seems plausible because it confirms people's assumptions about family conflicts. But she's made one crucial mistake. She's assumed that you don't have evidence to contradict her lies." Together, we began organizing my evidence into a comprehensive timeline that painted an irrefutable picture of my relationship with my children. Evelyn helped me understand the psychological impact of Nancy's manipulation on Kevin and Lisa, explaining how alienation works and why even loving children can be turned against devoted parents under the right circumstances. "The key is to approach them with empathy rather than anger," Evelyn explained. "They're victims of psychological manipulation too. Nancy has convinced them that their memories are false, that their love for you was based on lies. Breaking through that kind of conditioning requires patience and overwhelming evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." Martha, with her dancer's appreciation for timing and rhythm, helped me plan the sequence of my approach. "You can't dump everything on them at once," she said. "It needs to unfold like a choreographed piece, each revelation building on the last until the truth becomes undeniable." Most importantly, both women gave me something I had lost completely during those dark months of isolation. They gave me hope that love and truth could triumph over manipulation, and lies that the bonds between mother and child could survive even the most sophisticated psychological warfare. For the first time since Kevin's devastating email, I began to believe that I might actually get my children back. Under Evelyn's careful guidance, I spent 2 weeks crafting what would become the most important package of my life. Every document was chosen with surgical precision, designed to slip past Nancy's psychological barriers and reach the hearts of my children with irrefutable truth. The centerpiece was a carefully compiled timeline that cross-referenced my planner entries with Kevin and Lisa's own letters from the same periods. March 1998, my entry about staying up late to help Kevin with his science fair project, paired with his thank you card, expressing gratitude for my help and excitement about winning second place. April 2001. My documentation of attending Lisa's track meet, alongside her letter describing how proud she felt seeing me cheering from the stands. I included photocopies of report cards where teachers had written comments about my involvement in my children's education. "Kevin is fortunate to have such a supportive mother," his 4th grade teacher had written. Mrs. Betty's commitment to her children's success is evident in every interaction. Lisa's high school counselor had noted, "Betty is one of our most engaged parents. Her daughter clearly benefits from having such a devoted advocate at home." But the most powerful elements were Kevin and Lisa's own words, their childhood and teenage expressions of love that completely contradicted Nancy's narrative of neglect. I selected the most heartfelt examples quotes that would be impossible for them to dismiss as misremembered or taken out of context. The challenge was getting this evidence to them without Nancy intercepting it first. I remembered that Kevin's college roommate David had always been fond of me and had stayed in touch occasionally over the years. Through careful inquiry, I learned that David still maintained contact with Kevin and had expressed private concerns about the sudden estrangement from his family. I reached out to David with a carefully worded message explaining that I had important family documents that Kevin and Lisa needed to see information that would help them understand the truth about our family history. David, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama, but loyal to old friendships, agreed to serve as a neutral messenger. The package I sent through David was professionally presented, organized, like the educational materials I had prepared for students throughout my teaching career. A cover letter briefly explained that the enclosed documents were factual evidence about our family life information that would help them make informed decisions about our relationships based on truth rather than hearsay. For 3 agonizing days, I waited for some response, some sign that my children had received and reviewed the evidence. David confirmed that he had delivered the package to Kevin, personally mentioning that Kevin had looked surprised and troubled as he accepted it. The response came not from Kevin or Lisa, but from Mark, whose Facebook post that evening revealed exactly what had happened to my carefully prepared evidence. "Some people just won't accept reality," he wrote with cruel satisfaction. "When their lies are exposed, they resort to fake documents and manipulated evidence. It's really sad when someone becomes so delusional that they start fabricating history." According to David, who called me the next day with obvious distress, Nancy had been at Kevin's apartment when the package arrived. She had immediately denounced it as more of Betty's manipulation and convinced Kevin to return it unopened. She told him that reading your lies would just confuse him and undermine the healing process. David reported his voice heavy with skepticism about Nancy's motives, but Nancy's absolute control was beginning to show cracks that even she couldn't conceal. In her zealous campaign to maintain her narrative, she had begun making claims that were too specific and too extreme for careful observers to ignore. At the grocery store, she told Mrs. Patterson that I had never once attended a school event for my children, a claim that seemed absurd to anyone who remembered my 15 years as an elementary school teacher in the same district where Kevin and Lisa had been students. At church, she claimed I had been emotionally abusive throughout their childhood, creating trauma that was only now being properly addressed. Most damaging to her credibility was her assertion on Mark's Facebook page that I had abandoned my children for weeks at a time to pursue my own interests. Betty would disappear for days, leaving those poor kids to fend for themselves, she wrote in a comment that was visible to dozens of community members. The problem with Nancy's lies was that they contradicted the memories of too many people who had actually known our family. Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor for 20 years, quietly mentioned to several friends that she had never seen me away from home for more than a day or two, and certainly never for the extended periods Nancy was describing. The principal at Lisa's old elementary school, when asked casually about my involvement as a parent, had responded with genuine confusion about Nancy's claims. Betty was one of our most involved parents, she told a mutual friend. She volunteered for field trips, helped with fundraisers, and never missed a parent conference. I can't imagine where these stories about neglect are coming from. Even some of Mark's online supporters began to express subtle doubts about the increasingly dramatic nature of Nancy's accusations. This sounds pretty extreme. One person commented on his latest post. Are you sure you have all the facts straight? Another wrote, I remember Betty as being a really dedicated teacher. This doesn't sound like the same person. The cracks in Nancy's narrative were small, but growing like hairline fractures in a foundation that would eventually bring down the entire structure of lies she had built. People were beginning to remember the Betty they had known for decades, the devoted mother and dedicated teacher, and finding it harder to reconcile that memory with Nancy's portrait of a neglectful, selfish woman. Meanwhile, according to David's carefully worded reports, Kevin was showing signs of internal conflict that suggested Nancy's hold on him wasn't as complete as she believed. He had been asking David questions about our family's past, seeking confirmation of memories that Nancy had told him were false or exaggerated. He asked me if I remembered you being at his college graduation, David told me during one of our brief phone conversations. When I said, of course you were there, that you were crying with pride in the front row, he got this really strange look on his face, like he was trying to reconcile what I was saying with what someone else had told him. Lisa's reaction was harder to gauge, but David had heard from mutual friends that she seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the public nature of the family conflict, where Kevin appeared to be genuinely struggling with conflicting memories and emotions. Lisa seemed more concerned about the community drama and the attention it was bringing to their private family matters. The seeds of doubt were planted and beginning to grow, but Nancy's psychological control was still strong enough to prevent my children from reaching out to me directly. They were caught between their manipulated memories and their emerging doubts, unable to take the step that would bring them back to the truth about who we really were as a family. It was time for a more direct approach, one that would force the truth into the open, where Nancy's lies couldn't survive the scrutiny of public examination. After weeks of watching my carefully prepared evidence dismissed and my children's doubts suppressed by Nancy's manipulation, I sat across from Arthur Brennan, the attorney that Martha had recommended, feeling both terrified and determined. His office walls were lined with law books and framed certificates that spoke to decades of experience in defamation and family law cases. Mrs. Betty, Arthur said, reviewing the extensive documentation I had brought to our meeting, in 40 years of practice, I've rarely seen such clear-cut evidence of systematic character assassination. What your sister-in-law has done goes far beyond family disagreement. This is actionable defamation with measurable damages to your reputation and relationships. Evelyn had accompanied me to provide professional context about the psychological manipulation involved. The alienation tactics Nancy has employed are textbook examples of emotional abuse, she explained to Arthur. She's not just lying about Betty's character. She's systematically destroying a mother's relationship with her children through calculated psychological warfare. Arthur's strategy was methodical and devastating. First, he would send a formal cease and desist letter to Nancy and Mark, detailing the extensive evidence we possessed and demanding immediate public retractions of their lies. Simultaneously, he would prepare a comprehensive statement for local media outlets, presenting the documented truth about my relationship with my children and exposing the systematic nature of Nancy's campaign. The beauty of your case, Arthur explained as he organized my planners and letters into legal exhibits, is that you have 35 years of contemporaneous documentation. These aren't reconstructed memories or he said, she said arguments. These are dated, verifiable records that prove your devotion to your children and directly contradict every claim Nancy has made about your parenting. The cease and desist letter was a masterpiece of legal precision, running 12 pages and methodically dismantling every lie Nancy and Mark had spread. It included photocopies of Kevin and Lisa's own letters expressing love and gratitude planner entries, documenting countless school events I had attended, and teacher evaluations praising my involvement in my children's education. Your client's claims that Mrs. Betty was a neglectful mother are not only false, but demonstrably malicious, the letter stated. We possess overwhelming documentary evidence proving Mrs. Betty's exceptional devotion to her children, including hundreds of letters from Kevin and Lisa themselves expressing gratitude for her love and support. Your continued defamation will result in civil action seeking damages for harm to reputation, emotional distress, and destruction of family relationships. The letter demanded complete retractions within 10 days, public apologies, acknowledging the false nature of their claims, and immediate cessation of all defamatory statements. The alternative was a lawsuit that would make every piece of evidence public and expose their lies to the entire community. Simultaneously, Arthur released a carefully crafted statement to the local newspaper and community blog that had been following the story. Local teacher fights back against false accusations ran as the headline, accompanied by photographs of my teaching awards and selected excerpts from Kevin and Lisa's childhood letters. The article presented the evidence, methodically allowing readers to see the stark contrast between Nancy's claims and the documented reality of our family life. It included quotes from former principals praising my dedication, from Kevin's college graduation speech thanking me for my sacrifices, and from Lisa's high school counselor describing me as one of our most engaged and loving parents. The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours of the article's publication, my phone was ringing with calls from neighbors and former colleagues expressing outrage at what had been done to me. The comment section online filled with people sharing their own memories of my involvement in school events and community activities. I remember Betty volunteering at every field trip, wrote one parent. She was always the first to sign up and the last to leave. How could anyone call her neglectful? Another comment read, Betty taught my daughter and was the most caring teacher we ever encountered. These accusations are obviously false to anyone who actually knows her. But the most important reaction came from Kevin himself, whose world was shattered by seeing his own childhood words quoted in a legal document that exposed the lies he had been told. David called me that evening with a report that filled me with hope and heartbreak in equal measure. He's in complete shock, David said, his voice heavy with concern for his friend. When he saw that article, especially the parts quoting his own letters to you, he just sat there staring at it for 20 minutes without saying a word. I think reality is finally breaking through whatever Nancy convinced him to believe. According to David, Kevin had locked himself in his bedroom after reading the article, refusing to speak to Nancy or Mark, despite their frantic attempts to explain away the evidence. Nancy keeps insisting that you fabricated the letters somehow, but Kevin knows his own handwriting. He knows those feelings were real when he wrote them. The legal pressure had also forced Mark to remove many of his defamatory Facebook posts, though not before screenshots had been taken for evidence. His latest posts were defensive and increasingly desperate, claiming that the letters were taken out of context and that I was using manipulation tactics to confuse the situation. Lisa's reaction was more complex and harder to read. Friends reported that she seemed deeply troubled by the public nature of the conflict and embarrassed by the community attention it was generating. Where Kevin appeared to be wrestling with genuine emotional turmoil as he confronted the truth, Lisa seemed more concerned about appearances and social consequences. She's been asking mutual friends what they think about the situation, one acquaintance reported. It's like she's trying to gauge which side the community is supporting before she decides how to respond. Nancy's response to the legal action was pure panic mixed with desperate aggression. She attempted to contact local media outlets with her own version of events, but found that Arthur's careful documentation had made her claims appear obviously false to any objective observer. Her attempts to rally support on social media backfired as more and more people came forward with memories that contradicted her narrative. The foundation of lies she had built was crumbling under the weight of documented truth, but Nancy wasn't ready to surrender. According to mutual friends, she was frantically coaching Kevin and Lisa on how to respond to the evidence, trying to convince them that their own memories and written words were somehow unreliable or misunderstood. But the damage was done. The truth was finally in the open, and even Nancy's skilled manipulation couldn't explain away 35 years of documented love and devotion. Kevin was beginning to remember who I really was, and Lisa was starting to question the narrative she had accepted so readily. The battle for my children's hearts had shifted dramatically in my favor, but the war wasn't over yet. Nancy still held psychological influence over them, and breaking free from that kind of control would require courage that my children might not yet possess. Still, for the first time since this nightmare began, I had hope that love and truth would ultimately triumph over manipulation and lies. The response to Arthur's public statement exceeded every expectation we had dared to hold. Within 24 hours, the local newspaper's online article had been shared over 1,000 times across social media platforms. The comment section overflowed with expressions of outrage at Nancy's manipulation and overwhelming support for my fight to reclaim my children's hearts. "This is absolutely heartbreaking," wrote Sarah Martinez, whose daughter had been in my third grade class 15 years earlier. Mrs. Betty was the most caring teacher my child ever had. She stayed after school countless times to help struggling students. Anyone who knows her would know these accusations are lies. The responses to her comment created a thread of dozens of similar testimonials from former students and their parents. My phone rang constantly with calls from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former teaching colleagues reached out to express their shock and support. "Betty, I've been following this nightmare online," said Principal Henderson, who had hired me at Roosevelt Elementary 20 years ago. "Every teacher in our district knows what kind of person you are. We're all appalled by what's been done to you." Local television stations began covering the story as an example of how family conflicts can spiral into community-wide drama. The contrast between my documented evidence and Nancy's unsubstantiated accusations became impossible for objective observers to ignore. When we look at 35 years of daily records showing active parental involvement versus accusations that appeared only after a financial dispute, the truth becomes clear, reported Channel 7's investigative team. Most touching were the messages from my former students, now adults, with children of their own. "Mrs. Betty changed my life," wrote Michael Chen, who had struggled with dyslexia in my classroom. "She spent her lunch breaks tutoring me when I couldn't afford outside help. She believed in me when no one else did. The idea that she could neglect her own children is absurd to anyone who experienced her love and dedication." The community's response wasn't just supportive, it was actively protective. When Nancy made the mistake of shopping at our local grocery store the day after the article ran, she found herself facing a gauntlet of former neighbors and acquaintances who were no longer willing to politely ignore her behavior. "How could you do this to Betty?" demanded Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, who had finally understood the truth about Nancy's character. That woman sacrificed everything for her family and this community. You should be ashamed of yourself." Other shoppers gathered around their expressions, ranging from disappointment to outright disgust, as Nancy hurried through her shopping with her head down. Nancy's desperation revealed itself in increasingly erratic and self-destructive behavior. Cornered by overwhelming evidence and public condemnation, she began lashing out at anyone who challenged her narrative. At the post office, she screamed at the clerk when asked about the certified letters being returned from Arthur's law firm. "This is all lies," she shouted loud enough for the entire building to hear. "Betty is a manipulative liar who's fooled everyone." Her most desperate move was attempting to break into my house while I was at dance class, apparently hoping to find and destroy evidence she thought I might still possess. Mrs. Henderson saw her trying to force open my back door and called the police immediately. When officers arrived, Nancy claimed she was checking on my welfare because she was concerned about my mental state. The police report documenting her attempted break-in became another piece of evidence for Arthur's case, showing the lengths Nancy was willing to go to maintain her lies. "This woman is clearly desperate," Officer Rodriguez told me when I returned home to find crime scene tape around my back door. "Innocent people don't break into houses to destroy evidence that doesn't exist." Mark's online campaign became increasingly frantic and incoherent as his credibility crumbled along with his aunt's. His posts grew longer and more defensive, filled with conspiracy theories about how I had somehow fabricated decades of documentation. "Don't be fooled by fake evidence," he wrote in a rambling Facebook post that garnered more criticism than support. "Some people are so manipulative, they'll forge their own children's handwriting to get sympathy." But the comments on his posts had turned against him completely. "Mark, we've seen the evidence," wrote one former supporter. "Those letters are clearly authentic, and the planners show consistent handwriting over decades. You and your aunt need to admit you were wrong and apologize to Betty." The most profound change was happening in Kevin, whose internal struggle was visible to everyone who knew him. David reported that Kevin had been calling in sick to work for days, unable to concentrate on anything except the devastating realization that he had been manipulated into abandoning his loving mother. "He keeps reading and rereading those letters he wrote to you as a kid," David told me during one of our careful phone conversations. "I found him crying over the one where he called you his hero after his high school graduation. He says he can't believe he forgot how much you meant to him." Kevin's tentative outreach came through Dr. Reed, who called me on a Thursday evening with barely contained excitement in her voice. "Betty, I just received a call from your son. He's in tremendous emotional distress, but he wants to meet with you. He says he needs to understand how he could have been so wrong about everything." The phone call with Kevin that followed was one of the most difficult and hopeful conversations of my life. His voice was thick with tears and shame as he struggled to find words for his confusion and regret. "Mom, I don't understand what happened to me," he whispered. "I read my own letters to you, and I remember writing every word. I remember feeling that gratitude and love. How did I forget? How did I let Nancy convince me that none of it was real?" Lisa's response was more complex, but equally encouraging. According to mutual friends, she had become increasingly disturbed by Nancy's erratic behavior and obvious desperation. The elegant, controlled woman who had once seemed so reasonable was now appearing unhinged and vindictive in ways that made Lisa deeply uncomfortable. "I think the public nature of everything has really affected Lisa," reported Jennifer Walsh, who had taught with me years ago and maintained friendships with many families in our community. She's seeing how the community has rallied around you, and she's starting to question whether she was misled about the situation. More tellingly, Lisa had quietly removed several of Mark's posts from her social media feeds and stopped engaging with Nancy's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain their alliance. While she hadn't reached out to me directly yet, her withdrawal from Nancy's campaign spoke volumes about her changing perspective. The foundation of lies that Nancy had built was collapsing under the weight of public scrutiny and documented truth. But more importantly, the psychological hold she had established over my children was finally breaking, allowing their natural love and true memories to surface through the manipulation. For the first time in months, I began to believe that my family could be healed and that the bonds Nancy had tried to destroy were stronger than her capacity for cruelty. The meeting with Kevin took place in Dr. Reed's office on a gray Tuesday morning that would forever mark the beginning of our family's healing. I arrived early, my hands shaking as I carried a box containing the most precious evidence of our relationship. His childhood letters, photos of us together, and the planner entries documenting thousands of moments we had shared. Kevin walked in looking older than his 31 years, his face marked by sleepless nights and emotional turmoil. The confident young man who had written that devastating email just months ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and ashamed. When our eyes met, he burst into tears that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he sobbed, collapsing into the chair across from me. "I don't know how I could have believed those things about you. I don't know how I could have forgotten who you really are." Dr. Reed guided our conversation with the skilled compassion of someone who had spent decades helping families navigate psychological trauma. She encouraged me to show Kevin the evidence methodically, letting each piece of documentation speak for itself rather than overwhelming him with explanations or accusations. The letter that broke him completely was one he had written to me during his sophomore year of college when he was struggling with depression and academic pressure. "Dear Mom, I don't know what I would do without you. When I called you crying at 2 a.m. last week, you didn't make me feel stupid or weak. You just listened and reminded me how strong I am. You said you believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I love you more than words can express. I remember writing this." Kevin whispered, his voice breaking as he held the letter with trembling hands. "I remember that phone call. I was in my dorm room feeling like a complete failure, and you talked to me for 2 hours until I felt human again. How could Nancy convince me that you were never there for me when I have proof that you were everything to me?" I showed him my planners from his childhood, entry after entry, documenting the life we had built together. His first day of kindergarten. Kevin was so brave walking into school. I stayed in the parking lot for an hour crying with pride. His middle school science fair, stayed up until 3 a.m. helping Kevin perfect his volcano project. His excitement about learning makes every sacrifice worth it. His high school graduation, watching Kevin receive his diploma, was the proudest moment of my life. All those years of homework battles and teenage arguments led to this perfect moment. "This is 35 years of loving you," I said quietly, gesturing to the stacks of documentation spread across Dr. Reed's table. "This is the truth about who we were as a family before Nancy's lies poisoned your memories." Kevin spent 2 hours reading through his own letters, my planner entries, and school records that painted a picture of devoted motherhood that contradicted every word Nancy had spoken. With each piece of evidence, I watched his anger toward me transform into fury at himself and the woman who had manipulated him so completely. She made me hate you. He said, his voice filled with a rage I had never heard from him before. She took 30 years of love and twisted it into something ugly and false. She made me forget my own childhood, my own feelings, my own gratitude for everything you did for me. The legal consequences for Nancy began unfolding, even as Kevin and I worked to rebuild our relationship. Arthur's defamation lawsuit moved forward with devastating efficiency, armed with evidence that made Nancy's position completely indefensible. The financial penalties alone would bankrupt her, but the criminal charges for harassment and attempted breaking and entering ensured that her destruction would be both public and permanent. When the sheriff served Nancy with papers at her apartment, neighbors reported that she screamed accusations and threats so loudly that police had to be called to maintain order. Her claims that I had fabricated evidence and brainwashed the community sounded increasingly unhinged to anyone who had seen the overwhelming documentation of my innocence. Mark's online platform collapsed entirely as his employers at the marketing firm where he worked became aware of his defamatory campaign against a respected community member. His supervisor called Arthur's office to express the company's horror at Mark's behavior and to confirm that his employment had been terminated immediately. We had no idea one of our employees was engaged in this kind of malicious harassment, his former boss told the local newspaper. This company does not tolerate character assassination or cyberbullying in any form. Mr. Mark's actions do not represent our values or standards. Lisa's transformation was slower, but no less profound than Kevin's. Witnessing her brother's emotional breakdown and genuine reconciliation with me forced her to confront her own complicity in Nancy's lies. The composed, distant young woman who had blocked my phone calls began reaching out to mutual friends, asking careful questions about their memories of our family. Lisa called me yesterday, reported Martha from my dance class, who had known Lisa since she was a child. She wanted to know if I remembered her being happy as a kid, if I thought you were a good mother. I told her the truth that you were one of the most devoted mothers I've ever known, and that she always seemed like a loved, confident child. Lisa's first direct contact with me came through a brief, carefully worded email that arrived 2 weeks after Kevin's breakthrough. Mom, I'm trying to understand what happened to our family. Kevin showed me some of the evidence you presented to him. I think I may have been very wrong about some things. Could we talk? The phone conversation that followed was hesitant and formal, nothing like the easy intimacy Kevin and I were rebuilding. But it was a beginning and acknowledgement that Nancy's version of our family history might not be the complete truth. I remember writing those letters to you, Lisa admitted quietly. I remember feeling grateful for everything you did for us. But Nancy said that children often feel obligated to express gratitude even when parents are emotionally manipulative. She made me question my own memories, my own feelings. Your feelings were real, I told her gently, following Dr. Reed's advice to avoid overwhelming her with too much emotion too quickly. Your gratitude was real because the love that inspired it was real. Nancy convinced you to doubt your own heart, but your heart was telling you the truth all along. The community's response to Kevin's public reconciliation with me was overwhelmingly supportive. When we appeared together at church for the first time in months, the congregation burst into spontaneous applause. Former students who had followed the story online sent flowers and cards celebrating our reunion. But the most meaningful moment came when Kevin stood up during the service and asked to address the congregation. I want to publicly apologize to my mother and to this community, he said, his voice strong despite his obvious emotion. I was manipulated into believing lies about the woman who sacrificed everything for my happiness. Betty Johnson is the best mother anyone could ask for, and I'm ashamed that I ever doubted her love. Nancy's complete defeat was both legal and social. Facing criminal charges, crushing financial penalties, and total ostracism from the community, she made one final desperate attempt to salvage her reputation by granting an interview to a local television station. The interview was a disaster that only further exposed her vindictive nature and obvious lies. When asked to respond to the evidence I had presented, Nancy claimed it was all fabricated, a conspiracy involving dozens of people who had somehow created false documents spanning decades. Her explanations became increasingly incoherent as the interviewer pressed her for specifics until she finally stormed out of the studio, screaming about media bias and corrupt journalists. The interview aired once and was never repeated, but clips of Nancy's unhinged behavior spread across social media as evidence of her complete psychological breakdown. Any remaining sympathy for her position evaporated as the community watched her true character revealed in all its bitter, vindictive ugliness. Justice was being served, but more importantly, my family was beginning to heal from the wounds Nancy had inflicted with her campaign of lies and manipulation. Lisa's journey back to me was more gradual than Kevin's dramatic breakthrough, reflecting her naturally cautious personality and the deeper shame she felt about her complicity in Nancy's campaign. Our second phone conversation, 3 weeks after the first, revealed a young woman struggling to reconcile the mother she remembered with the narrative of neglect she had accepted. "I keep thinking about my wedding day," Lisa said quietly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You worked 3 extra shifts that month to pay for my dress. You spent your entire vacation helping me with preparations. How did I forget that? How did I let Nancy convince me that you were selfish and unsupportive?" Dr. Reed had prepared me for Lisa's particular form of guilt, explaining that children who participate in parental alienation often experience profound shame when they realize how thoroughly they've been manipulated. "She's not just reconnecting with you," Dr. Reed explained. "She's having to forgive herself for abandoning someone who loved her unconditionally." Our first face-to-face meeting took place at a quiet cafe downtown Neutral Territory, where Lisa could feel safe processing her emotions without pressure. She arrived looking fragile and uncertain, nothing like the confident young woman who had blocked my calls just months earlier. "Mom, I need you to know that I never stopped loving you," she said, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to find the right words. Even when I believed Nancy's lies, there was always this voice in my head saying something was wrong. I just didn't have the courage to trust my own instincts. I reached across the table and took her hands, feeling the same rush of maternal love that had sustained me through 30 years of motherhood. "You don't need to apologize for being manipulated, sweetheart. Nancy is skilled at psychological manipulation. She studied our family for years, looking for weaknesses she could exploit. You were her victim, not her accomplice." Lisa's healing process was supported by her own therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in recovering from psychological manipulation. Through these sessions, she began to understand how Nancy had systematically undermined her confidence in her own memories and feelings, replacing them with a narrative that served Nancy's vindictive purposes. "Nancy made me feel guilty for loving you," Lisa explained during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "She said that healthy adults don't need their parents the way I needed you. She convinced me that my gratitude was actually codependency, that my love was actually obligation." Kevin's reconciliation with me had been more emotionally dramatic, but it was also complete and unwavering. He threw himself into rebuilding our relationship with the same intensity he had once directed toward rejecting me. He called daily, visited weekly, and made a point of publicly supporting me whenever the opportunity arose. "I have 30 years of love to make up for," he told me one evening as we looked through old photo albums together. "I know we can't get back the time we lost, but I want to spend every day for the rest of my life proving that I remember who you really are." The legal resolution of Nancy's case was as devastating as Arthur had predicted. The defamation lawsuit resulted in a judgment that would follow her for the rest of her life, but the criminal charges were what truly destroyed her. Harassment, attempted breaking and entering, and criminal conspiracy to commit defamation carried sentences that ensured she would spend significant time in prison. During her sentencing hearing, Nancy made one final attempt to portray herself as the victim, claiming that she had been trying to protect my children from an abusive mother. Judge Morrison's response was swift and unforgiving. "Ms. Nancy, this court has reviewed extensive evidence of your systematic campaign to destroy a mother's relationship with her children through lies and manipulation," he said, his voice heavy with disgust. "Your actions represent some of the most cruel and vindictive behavior this court has encountered. The evidence shows clearly that Mrs. Betty was a devoted, loving mother, while you orchestrated a campaign of psychological terrorism against an innocent family." Nancy was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 5 years of probation, during which she was forbidden from any contact with my family or from making any public statements about us. The financial judgment bankrupted her completely, forcing her to sell her home and car to pay even a fraction of what she owed. Mark's destruction was less dramatic but equally complete. His termination from his job led to a series of short-term positions as word of his behavior spread through professional networks. His social media presence, once a source of vindictive pleasure, became a liability that followed him wherever he tried to rebuild his reputation. No reputable company wants to hire someone who wages public character assassination campaigns, his former supervisor told a mutual acquaintance. What he did to Mrs. Betty revealed a character flaw that makes him unemployable in any position requiring judgment or integrity. The community's response to our family's healing was overwhelmingly supportive and celebratory. When Kevin and Lisa accompanied me to the annual school fundraiser, former colleagues and students' families surrounded us with warm congratulations and expressions of joy at our reunion. "This is how it should be," said Principal Henderson, watching Kevin and Lisa flank me protectively as we toured the school where I had taught for 15 years. "Family love is stronger than any lie. Truth always finds a way to the surface. My grandchildren, who had been kept from me during the months of estrangement, were slowly reintroduced to my life through carefully planned visits that allowed them to form their own relationships with me without the pressure of adult conflicts. 8-year-old Emma Kevin's daughter summed up the situation with the clarity that only children possess. "I missed you, Grandma Betty," she said, climbing into my lap during her first visit to my house in 6 months. "Daddy was sad when he thought you didn't love us anymore, but I knew you still loved us because love doesn't just go away." The public acclaim that followed our story's resolution was gratifying, but secondary to the personal healing that was taking place within our family. Local media outlets featured our reunion as an example of how truth and love can triumph over manipulation and lies. national advocacy groups for parental alienation asked me to share our story as inspiration for other families facing similar crises. But the most meaningful recognition came from my former students who organized a surprise celebration at the community center to honor both my teaching career and my perseverance through the crisis. Hundreds of people attended, sharing stories about how I had influenced their lives and expressing their joy at seeing justice served. Mrs. Betty taught me that truth matters more than convenience, said Michael Chen, now a successful engineer with children of his own. Watching her fight for her family taught me that love is worth defending, no matter how hard the battle becomes. As I looked around the room filled with former students, their parents, teaching colleagues, and community members who had supported me through the darkest period of my life, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the strength that had carried me through the crisis and the love that had ultimately triumphed over Nancy's malice. The journey wasn't over. Kevin and Lisa were still healing from the psychological trauma Nancy had inflicted, and our relationships bore scars that would probably never completely fade. But we were together again, bound by truth and love rather than manipulation and lies. Nancy's attempt to destroy our family had ultimately made us stronger, more aware of how precious our bonds truly were. 3 years have passed since Nancy's campaign nearly destroyed my family, and I find myself living a life I could never have imagined during those dark months of isolation and despair. My mornings begin with coffee on the front porch, often shared with Kevin when he stops by before work, or Lisa when she brings the grandchildren for weekend visits. The silence that once threatened to suffocate me has been replaced by the gentle rhythm of a family rebuilding itself on foundations of truth and hard-won wisdom. The senior dance class that introduced me to Martha and Dr. Reed has become the cornerstone of my weekly routine. Our little group has grown into a tight-knit community of women who support each other through life's challenges and celebrate each other's victories. I've discovered a passion for ballroom dancing that I never knew existed, and the physical activity has restored not just my health, but my confidence in my own vitality and grace. Kevin and Lisa's relationships with me are different now, marked by a deeper appreciation for what we nearly lost and a conscious commitment to honest communication. We talk regularly about the manipulation we all experienced, not to dwell on past pain, but to ensure we never forget the lessons it taught us about the fragility of family bonds and the importance of protecting them. Nancy serves her sentence in a facility 200 miles away, and we rarely speak of her anymore, except in the context of helping other families recognize the warning signs of parental alienation. Her pathological envy and vindictive nature ultimately destroyed her own life more completely than she ever managed to damage ours. Mark has disappeared from our community entirely, his reputation so thoroughly ruined that rebuilding seemed impossible. The wisdom I've gained from this ordeal runs deeper than I ever expected. I understand now that evil can wear the face of family, that love must sometimes be defended with the same vigor that others reserve for war, and that truth has a power that no amount of manipulation can permanently suppress. The scars Nancy left on our family have become sources of strength rather than weakness, reminders of what we survived and what we're capable of overcoming together. Looking toward the future, I feel a serenity that encompasses both sorrow for the time we lost and gratitude for the love we recovered. My children and grandchildren know me now, not just as their devoted mother and grandmother, but as someone who fought for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. That knowledge has created a bond between us that no amount of manipulation could ever break again. This experience taught me that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the greatest courage, and that a mother's heart, when tested by fire, emerges not broken, but refined into something even more precious than before.